Somebody said Epiphany. Hey, there we go. We got power. Anybody heard that word? Well, obviously some of you have, but also called the Three Kings Day. If you pick, at least my iPhone, when you look at the calendar, the stuff that whoever puts those things in there, that whatever, it's called Three Kings Day. Coming of the Three Wise Men. Or in the German community, the Holy Three Wise Men. Heilige Drei Könige. Did this church used to have services on Epiphany? Okay, so you remember that. Does that make you old, Eric? Yes. Okay, yeah. Does that make him old? Some churches still have services on the Epiphany, or whatever word you want to use, the coming of the three wise men. The word Epiphany, I'm going to be talking about that today. Epiphany, I think, in its generic terms, just means it's an aha moment when, now I see. Something is suddenly made clear to you. Usually by a single event, different than a slowly coming to an understanding. Epiphany is kind of like that, and now I get it. So I want to think about that event this morning, and I'm going to start by reading in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. If you want to turn there, have at her, and if not, I'll just be reading anyway. Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Fairly familiar story. By the way, did you notice what Matthew missed telling us in the story? He missed telling us that there was three of them. He missed telling us that they were riding camels, richly decorated camels. Because all the pictures I've ever seen of them, there's three of them, and they're riding richly decorated camels. Kind of. Are there three? You're right, there's three. What was Matthew thinking? But then all the pictures I've ever seen of Mary and Joseph making their way to Bethlehem, she's riding a donkey as well. And Luke forgot to mention that. And all the pictures show Jesus being born in a cave or a stable being used, a cave being used as a stable. And they missed that part too. If you hear the sound of a drum beating, that's just me beating my drum. I get on this thing. Susan gets tired of me beating that drum. So here's these magi, wise men, from somewhere in the east, probably Persia. They saw a star, and they interpreted that star to mean there is a new king born to the Jews. So where did they go? The capital city. Where else would be the logical place for a new king to be born? In the capital city, to the king and his wife, right? And the king is Herod. So they go to the king and they say, so where's this king, this new one that's born? Because we saw his star, and the star said there's a new king born. Herod does something really interesting that I find fascinating. Verse 3 there, when King Herod heard this, all they asked was, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, verse 3, he was disturbed. Well, partly because he knew it wasn't him. It wasn't him and his wife. King Herod was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Obviously, the internet was working well. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them, where's this baby born? It's not what it says. Where the Christ was to be born? Somehow Herod, I don't know if somebody was whispering in his ear or what, he immediately attributes this to the Christ. For us, that's just another name. Jesus Christ, first name, last name. To them, Christ meant the Messiah, the one come to free the people, the one come to bring Israel back to their former glory, the one sent from God to do all this. Where's the Christ going to be born is what Herod asked. And I'd never actually thought about that until this week when I was working on this. How did Herod know so quickly what this was all about? So he goes to the Jewish teachers of the law, asks them, where's the Christ to be born? And the teachers of the law tell him it's going to be born in Bethlehem. Oh, that's just a couple miles down the road. And he decides to use these wise men, these magi, these foreigners, as his spies. You go, you check it out. And as soon as you find him, you come back and tell me so I can come and worship him too. Wink, wink. Had Herod just gone with them right away, the story would be written in a whole different way. But he decided to be sneaky. And then, after they see the Christ, then God says, okay, don't go back to Herod. Go somewhere, take a different road home. So that's all good. But anyway, we'll go back to verse 10 in that text that I read. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. I'm assuming they had kind of lost sight of the star when they were going to Jerusalem. I don't know that. Anyway, they left Jerusalem. They started on their way to Bethlehem, and then they saw the star again, finally. Good, now we got some direction. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, of incense, and of myrrh. They bowed down and worshiped him. That's why we call this Epiphany. For these magi, these wise men, it was revealed in this moment that this baby is God. Now, we call it Epiphany. In the Eastern Christian communities like Greek Orthodox, some of those other Christian churches, they don't call it Epiphany, they call it Theophany, which I kind of like better because theos is that Latin for God, I think. Is that correct? It's like not just, aha, now I see it. Theophany is, aha, now I see God. It's different. Big different. Before their very eyes, it was revealed to them, this baby is God. Now, Matthew is the only one of the four Gospels who records this event, which is kind of interesting. Did the others not think it was important? Particularly Luke, who has so many details of the birth. Why is Matthew the only one who records it? It's more than just an interesting little footnote after the birth. See, Matthew has this recurring theme in his writing. His recurring theme is Jesus is the King of the Jews. Over and over and over, he hammers that home. So he's writing kind of to Jewish audiences who needed to hear this. Their king, their Messiah, had been born, and all the different things that happened in the life of this Messiah. A very clear emphasis in his writings of kingship, the Jewish king. Another thing about this whole event, it reveals not just to the wise men that this is God. It reveals to Mary and Joseph, this baby is God. Not that they didn't know that already, but sometimes you need to get it underlined. So here's this young couple with this baby. And these three, or however many, come from somewhere far away, and they present these gifts, and they bow down, and they worship him. You don't forget that. And then, I don't know if it was that next night or very shortly after, Joseph has this dream in the middle of the night where God says to him, get up, take the child and his mother and run for your life, because Herod's going to try to kill him. The fact that these magi had just worshiped this baby in this way, I think probably added urgency to Joseph's dream. This is for real. I try to imagine Joseph sitting up after this vision. First of all, just trying to wrap his own head around it, and turns over, says to Mary, Mary, we got to go. All of this reveals God to us, not just to them, but to us. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Isaiah the prophet says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. We'll call him God with us. God would come as a baby. Now that's kind of mind-blowing. Not so much for us because we've been raised on this, but for them it would be. A theophany. This would be God as a baby. So why didn't everyone understand? When this baby was born, here's this virgin, she had a baby. He's God. King Herod kind of got it. One of the least likely ones. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tried to kill him. He wouldn't have asked the leaders, where is the Christ to be born? He got it. But the rest of the Jewish nation crucified him. Why didn't they get it? Because this was brand new. In Genesis chapter, I'm going to go through a few places where God showed up. Maybe it's review for you, maybe not. Genesis chapter 18. And these that I'm going to list are not the only places where God shows up, but there's some of them. Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 and 2. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Early afternoon, it was crazy hot. He's sitting just inside the tent, so you can see what's going on outside, but it's not quite outside. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Abraham invites them to stay for lunch. He hurries to tell, the whole passage has this hurrying going on because he hurries to tell Sarah, get some flour, bake some bread, we got company. He runs to the herd and selects a nice fat calf. The servant hurries to prepare it, all during the hottest part of the day. I don't know if Abraham knew right from the start that this was God before him, or if he figured it out sometime during the visit. This was the visit during which one of them says to Abraham, 1 year from now, I'll come back and your wife Sarah will have a son. And Sarah, who's eavesdropping, laughs. And then this person says to Abraham, why'd your wife laugh? And she says, oh, I didn't laugh. Yeah, you did. Interesting exchanges. When they left this place, Abraham knew this was God. God had just visited him. It was a theophany. And that's when they go down the road to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham has this bargaining with them. You know, look, if there's 50 righteous people in Sodom, would you still, and he bargaining his way down. The writer of Hebrews may have had this thought in mind when he wrote in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. So that was a theophany. God showed up in human form to Abraham to give him a very clear message. Your wife is going to have a son. The beginning of the fulfillment of this promise that Abraham's descendants would carry on. Genesis chapter 32. Now it's Abraham's grandson. It's the story of Jacob. Jacob, the guy who years earlier had tricked his twin brother out of his birthright. The birthright basically is the right to be the head of the clan. Clans were very important. So his brother was angry, and Jacob ran for his life, went to a different country, and remained away for many, many years, during which time he got a job, he got married. A week later, he got married again. He had children with both of these wives, and he had children with their servants. So between 4 women, he had a number of kids. He accumulated great wealth in livestock, in servants, and gold, and now he's going home. Partly because he wasn't so welcome in his father-in-law's territory anymore. So he's heading home, and he finds out that Esau is still mad. So he sends extravagant gifts to Esau to try to appease him a little bit. And then in chapter 32, verse 24. By the way, then he also divides the people who are with him and his wives and children into different groups so that if Esau attacks one group, maybe the others can get away or something. In verse 24 of Genesis 32, so Jacob was left alone. He had sent the different parts of his wealth to different places. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. So Jacob has this wrestling match, and the man isn't identified in that way. It feels really weird. By the end of it, he realizes he's been wrestling with God. Jacob had a theophany. This was God. So it was a little different than the other time. Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Here we find Moses, who had been born a son to Hebrew slaves in Egypt. He had been adopted by the daughter of the Pharaoh, and he chose to defend the Hebrew slave against an Egyptian slave master, and he killed the Egyptian, and he fled for his life. And he's living in a different country where he gets married, and he works as a shepherd for his father-in-law, and now he's out in the desert. And he's tending sheep. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. He had a curious mind. What's going on here? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Moses had a theophany, but it was different than Abraham's or Jacob's. There was no human form. There was no doubt this is an unusual thing. But it was a theophany. Then God tells Moses, okay, it's time for you to go back to Egypt and to free my people from slavery. Something new was happening, and God showed up. So this was a different way, a different form. In Exodus chapter 13, the context is here the Hebrew nation has now left Egypt after all these plagues and stuff. And they're heading out into the desert, and it says there in chapter 13, the shortest way would have been to go north through the land of the Philistines, but God didn't want them to go that way, so he sends them the other way, and they go into the desert. And God shows up to them. Let's see, Exodus 13. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night, in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. So God shows up, but different again. It's not a human form. It's not a guy wrestling with him in the middle of the night. It's not a burning bush. Now it's a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. That's what it looks like when God shows up. And then in Exodus chapter 33, there's the story of Moses. They've come to Mount Sinai, and God has called Moses up to the mountain, and there's the warnings not to touch the mountain. I talked about this last week a little bit. And God gives Moses the 10 Commandments written on stone tablets. And Moses stays up there a long time, and the people get tired of waiting for him, so they make their own idol. Or Aaron, Moses' brother, makes an idol for them. Moses comes down. He sees what's going on, smashes the 10 Commandments, and then he goes back up. And then there's this exchange between Moses and God. For one, Moses said, "Those people down there are driving me nuts." Kind of. He says to God, "I don't know if I can do this. Show me your glory." God says, "Okay." And there's all kinds of thunder and fire and lightning and all kinds of things. And God says, "Okay, you see that crack in the rock? You step into that. And I'll cover you with my hand, and I'll walk by. And when I'm past, you can kind of see me from the back." A theophany. This is God. And then, many years later, Isaiah says, a virgin will have a baby and call him God with us. Nah, that prophet's crazy. That's not how God shows up. He doesn't show up as maybe a burning bush, maybe a pillar of fire, maybe thunder and lightning and all kinds of things. That's how God shows up. Not like this. Do you ever have your own preconceptions of how things happen? Absolutely, we do. It has to be like this. They must have shaken their heads at this crazy prophet. And then, some 700 years later, a virgin does have a baby. And these magi, these wise men, come from a country far to the east, and they bow down and they worship him. Had they gone to Jerusalem and told anybody after this, they might have been laughed at. That's not how God shows up. We know how God shows up. Just look at our Old Testament writings. Well, they didn't call them Old Testament. Look at the law and the prophets. God shows up in different ways. It was so terrifying, Moses couldn't even see him. And yet here was God showing up as a baby. Every one of those cases, just a side note, every time God showed up, it was kind of like there was an intersection and a turning point. God was doing something different now, beginning Abraham's descendants, turning Jacob from just a tribal chieftain with lots of kids and lots of wealth to actually the head of a growing nation. Telling Moses, "Time to free my people, get them out of Egypt now." Different things. Or Moses up on the mountain, the beginning of God speaking in a different way. Every time God shows up like that, it's an intersection. This is a theophany. And we've just celebrated Christmas. I think it's okay for us to pause for a moment and remember when Jesus was there, this baby, this was God with us. This was a theophany. The wise men saw it. Wow, this is God. And a few others got it, but not too many. Paul, in much later in the book of Colossians, Paul says of him, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." A theophany. "For by him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." A theophany, Jesus, God. One more thing about theophanies. Some of us would say, well, I've met God. He's told me stuff. Is that a theophany? You probably would be correct in saying that, because you well may have encountered him somewhere, and he may well have communicated things to you. The difference is these, what I would call a theophany, are visible, and they mean a turning of things for more than just what's happening in my own heart. So all I'm saying is, let's not dumb down the definition of theophany to say, oh yeah, we've all had them. It doesn't mean that God doesn't talk to us. But a theophany as such involves physical signs and a turning point for more than just my own thoughts. In all these examples, somebody saw God with their own eyes. It was more than just a feeling. But when we do have an encounter with God, there should be a turning point for us. When we come to a point, okay, this is God, and I think I need to change my direction now. So while January 6th came 2 days ago, I think it's fair that we recognize this, that this baby is God, still is. This day also reminds us that there will come a day when God will come again. There will be another theophany. And that will be a theophany that not just a few people see, but it will be something where the world recognizes this is God. Until that time, we have an invitation to believe in him, even though we don't see him, and to trust in him and to place our faith and our hope in him. First song we sang, "Come to Jesus and rest in him." I really like that phrase. It has a good sound to it. Place our faith in him, place our trust in him, and rest. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 20, he was chosen, this Jesus, he was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him, you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, so that your faith and hope are in God. Jesus came. God came. It's kind of up to us to decide what we do with him, as it was for them as well. Crystal, you got another song?